There's a cafe on the corner of Linaria Street and Bellevue Road, tucked just beside the old bookshop and beneath a canopy of small round trees. Every morning at exactly 7, it opens its sky blue door and exhales the scent of freshly baked lemon cakes and frothy milk. The windows wide and always a little foggy from steam. Rain has not started, but the air hums with promise. I'm wrapped in my favorite robe. Its cover is fraying at the edges. The sky looks heavy. The cafe smells like warm sugar. I don't want anything to change. He told the barista that the cafe was a place where dreams waited in cups, just under the phone. He said he once sipped a memory of his wife from a lavender latte, and it made his eyes sting in the best way. If it hears the quiet confessions and stores them in the sugar jars, or folds them gently between the napkins, the pages filled with pressed flowers and tea stains and small sketches of dreams I can't quite remember. I write in lowercase letters, slowly. Maybe it's the way the light lands on the counter, or the softness of the chairs, or how the rain always sounds like applause when it hits the roof. I can hear the trickle of water against ceramic pots. She hums while she works, some old lullaby that has no name. I hum along without realizing it. Or maybe it's the idea that someone is listening even when they're not speaking out loud. Like the words might spill if I move too fast. The one that smells faintly of lavender and chamomile. I hold a cup of jasmine tea in both hands. The rain might come, and if it does, the bell on the cafe door jingles as someone leaves. The lemon cakes are gone. A sparrow lands on the railing of my window and tilts its head at me. We share a moment in silence, two quiet things in a quiet world. I'll let it tap softly on the glass while I reread a chapter of the book I keep beside the kettle. I'll toast a slice of sourdough and drizzle honey until it glistens. I might take a nap under the yellow blanket by the couch. One of them cracks slightly as she sets it down, and for a moment, the aroma of lemon peel and butter drifts up toward my window, letting the steam warm my cheeks. The tea is pale and floral, just strong enough to remind me that I am awake, glow like lanterns when the sun is slow to rise. Above that cafe is my apartment. The notes float upward through the floorboards and the gentle cracks in the wall, settling in the corners of my ceiling like drifting petals. It's always the same few songs on mornings like this, soft jazz, sleepy piano pieces, and one instrumental lullaby that sounds like it was composed for clouds. It's a small space, not grand or particularly modern, but it wraps around me like a wool blanket. The walls are a gentle shade of oat, touched with peach in the morning sun, and the floor creaks in the places I love best. From my bedroom window, I can see the glass roof of the cafe and the line of people waiting patiently in their coats and scarves, quiet as the sky. Today, the clouds are low and silver. Downstairs, the cafe piano begins to play. Someone must have requested the rainy day playlist. I sit by the window and open my journal. The light is silver today. I pause to watch the barista below place 3 lemon cakes on the counter, their golden tops dusted with powdered sugar. The world feels perfectly still. I remember what the old man in the corner seat said last Tuesday. People like to tell their stories in the Cloud Cafe. I don't know why. I often wonder if the cafe listens. My neighbor across the hall is watering her window plants again. I don't plan to go outside today, but for now, I stay still. The piano song ends, and I write in my journal one more line. Some days are made of nothing, and that is more than enough. The rain arrived gently, as if it had been waiting for the right moment to begin. I watched it fall from the edge of the awning outside my window, soft and steady, like someone pouring water from a silver teapot. It tapped on the rooftops and threaded between tree branches, gathering quietly in the cracks of the street below. In the cafe, the lights had been turned a little lower. I don't know her name. She comes every few days, always wearing a different ribbon in her hair. Her fingers moved quickly, confidently, across the page. I could just make out the shape of a tree and what might have been a bird, wings spread wide. I watched her for a while, then returned to my journal. Today's was deep blue. I wrote about the ribbon girl, about the way the rain softened everything it touched, and about how quiet the world becomes when people allow it to rest. Not just orders, but people. It holds them gently, like a bookmark slipped between pages. It never rushes them or asks too much. Almost the same color as the cafe door. She sat by the window, removed her gloves. The rain continued, but there was a different rhythm now, a kind of softness that felt more like humming. The sky had turned the color of linen, and the trees along Linaria Street swayed slightly, as if nodding to a lullaby only they could hear. He wore the same coat, a little darker from the rain, and carried a folded newspaper under one arm. He greeted the barista with a bow of his head, then settled into the corner seat. No words were exchanged. His usual was already waiting for him on the table, a cup of black coffee, no sugar, and a slice of apple tart. The pages of the ribbon girl's sketchbook, the barista humming a tune that matched the raindrops on the roof, and ordered the same thing she always does, a lavender scone and a small cappuccino, casting a golden warmth that pressed softly against the cold glass, tracing the lines the raindrops made as they slid down the pane. Some moved quickly, others paused to join together. Below, the cafe lights began to glow again, this time deeper, like the golden hour had decided to arrive early. The steam from the espresso machine rose in lazy curls, and I could hear the faint clinking of cups being washed. Peppermint this time. Its coolness made the room feel fresher, like I had opened a window somewhere inside myself. I lit a small candle and placed it on the windowsill. Its flame flickered slightly, caught in the gentle draft that always slips beneath the door, and a few disappeared before reaching the bottom. It reminded me of how people come and go from the cafe. Some stay long enough to leave behind the shape of their laughter. Others pass through, barely brushing the edges. People had pulled their scarves tighter and spoken in murmurs, their words slipping into the hush like notes in a lullaby. Even the barista moved slower than usual, her motions more fluid, like she was dancing to a song only she could hear. I stood by the window for a long time. Around 10, the ribbon girl arrived. That's what I call her. I've never spoken to her, but I imagine her voice is soft and musical, the kind that makes you lean in without realizing. She always brings a book, though I've never seen her turn a single page. She spends most of her time looking out the window, like she's waiting for something she once saw in a dream to pass by again. I went to the kitchen and made another cup of tea. The ribbon girl had started sketching. Today I wrote with more care. Each letter felt like a footprint in fresh snow. At noon, the old man from last week returned. I like that the cafe remembers. By early afternoon, the clouds had thickened. I wrapped the yellow blanket around my shoulders and curled into the armchair by the window. There's something comforting about rain that knows how to fall quietly. I closed my eyes and let the sounds drift around me, the cup on the saucer, the scrape of a chair, and somewhere beneath it all, the heartbeat of a day that asked nothing from me except to notice it. The next morning came quietly, the light in the apartment soft and gentle, like a watercolor sky unfolding outside the window. Marisol stretched beneath the linen sheets, her body slow to move, her thoughts not yet tethered to the world. She stayed still for a moment, listening. There was a rhythm below her, not quite music, but something close. The cafe was waking. She dressed in her soft cotton robe and stepped onto the balcony. The sea of fog still lingered over the city, a tender hush spread over the streets. Inside, the walls were lined with shelves of teapots, old novels, and soft yellow bulbs that never quite reached full brightness. The sound barely rose above the general murmur of the cafe, but it was enough to stir something in Marisol's chest. Chamomile with orange blossom and a little lavender. he said, setting it down. We call it the soft hour. That's lovely. Do you name all your blends? The flavors were soft but vivid, like distant memories returning in fragments. She felt herself breathing more slowly, grounded in the moment. The world felt stitched together with threads of quiet here. The place was warm in a way she couldn't define. She returned upstairs to journal, then went for a walk through the nearby park, where paths twisted among mossy statues and lamplit arches. Even in the heart of the city, things felt slowed down here, as if the neighborhood lived slightly outside of time. He asked, gesturing to the blackboard above him, filled with looping chalk script and illustrations of leaves and beans. Some were quotes, others sketches or anonymous musings. She walked over, curious. Her drawings were usually abstract, full of swirling lines and shapes that only hinted at meaning. Tonight, though, her fingers traced the outline of a teacup, then a harp, then the window below her balcony. Pieces of her day filtered into the page. There is a quiet magic in waking up, not knowing what the day will give you. The apartment greeted her with a calm silence, the kind she hadn't realized she needed. She turned on a small lamp by the window and watched as the fog finally lifted. She left the window open just a crack, and the distant hum of the city mingled with the sound of the wind brushing through the eaves. She let the night fold over her like a soft blanket, her heart steadier than it had been in a long time, revealing the rooftops like islands appearing from a misty sea. She folded it and pinned it near the center, beneath a drawing of a moonlit window. People were seated in quiet corners, two older women sharing a crossword puzzle, a young man sketching in a spiral notebook, and someone humming softly as they worked behind the counter. The scent of toasted oats and warm cinnamon drifted upward, carried by the breeze. From the open door below, the clink of cups and faint murmurs of early patrons floated toward her. She went downstairs barefoot, drawn like a moth to the quiet energy of the Cloud Café. "Good morning," said a voice from the bar. It was Elio, the barista she had met yesterday. His hair looked even messier in the daylight, but his smile was the same. "Morning," Marisol replied, her voice still drowsy. "Coffee or tea today?" "I think tea," she said. "Surprise me." He nodded and began moving with practiced grace, selecting tins from the shelf behind him, measuring loose leaves into a strainer, pouring hot water over them. The steam curled into the air and carried with it something floral and citrusy. As she waited, she watched a girl at the far table gently pluck the strings of a small harp. Elio returned with a tray holding a wide clay mug. Marisol smiled as she wrapped her hands around the mug. "Only the ones that feel like stories," he replied. She took a sip and closed her eyes. When she opened her eyes, she noticed a small corkboard near the counter with handwritten notes pinned to it. "You can add something if you'd like," Elio said, watching her read. She found a pencil and a scrap of paper from the counter and wrote. The rest of the day drifted by. By evening, Marisol returned to her apartment with a warm sandwich and a little paper bag of shortbread from the cafe. She sat by the window, sketchbook open, pencil in hand. When she went to bed, the air was cool and still. Marisol woke to the scent of warm vanilla drifting through her window. Morning sunlight streamed in soft golden stripes across the wooden floor, dancing lightly on the edges of her sketchbook. She had fallen asleep with it on her knitstand, and one pencil had rolled halfway across the room. She stretched slowly, savoring the silence, her body still tucked in the gentle warmth of sleep. The apartment had begun to feel like a quiet friend, always waiting, always still. There was something about the way light moved across the shelves, how the curtain sighed gently in the breeze, pausing only to slip on her sandals. The cafe looked slightly different today. A few new flowers had appeared in small glass vases, and someone had changed the music to a soft instrumental melody that sounded like rain falling on leaves. Elio waved her over from behind the bar. She rose and moved to the balcony again, the morning air cool against her cheeks. "Would you like one?" "I'll let Lyre know. He's the one who bakes." She paused halfway up. A shelf built into the wall held a small glass box, the kind used to display keepsakes. Inside was a folded letter and a dried rose. Beneath it, a little tag read, "A moment worth remembering," and the soft hour tea again, if that's all right. Sketching strangers at nearby tables. She noticed how people relaxed here, how shoulders dropped. For the first time in a long while, she felt completely still inside, the edges of her heart no longer frayed. With each chapter, Marisol felt herself drawn into the world, each sentence like a thread pulled gently through her thoughts. How conversations meandered without urgency. She filled her pages with small moments. A woman fixing a scarf for her friend. A child with hot chocolate, concentrating hard to sip without spilling. A man reading aloud to someone who leaned closer to catch every word. Below, the Cloud Café had already opened its doors. Someone was laughing softly. Had someone left it behind when they moved? Or had it always been there, waiting for someone like her to notice? She sat by the window and wrote in her journal, noting the things she saw, the smells she remembered, the exact flavor of the tea on her tongue. She began to list the small details that made her feel rooted, even if only for today. And a bell jingled as a couple stepped inside. She made her way down, filling the space with a rhythm that felt like breathing. Stars began to pierce through the fading light, one by one. She opened the window wider, letting in the cool night breeze. Afterward, she sat on the floor by the bookshelf and chose a thin novel bound in blue cloth. She didn't recognize the author, wrapped herself in a light shawl, and stepped out onto the balcony. Below, the cafe had dimmed its lights, and a candle flickered on every table. A couple danced in the far corner, swaying to a song only they could hear. But the title was written in gold foil, "Letters to the Sky." "I was hoping you'd be in," he said. "We made a new pastry today. Apple and rosemary galette." "Of course," she said, smiling, "coming right up." The tartness of apple, the unexpected hint of rosemary, and the buttery flake of pastry brought a small gasp of joy. "This is perfect." She chose a seat by the window, where a shaft of sun illuminated her table in a warm glow. Outside, a tabby cat sat perched on the stone step, eyes closed in perfect stillness. The quiet in the cafe felt layered, better than I thought I would. This place, it makes it easy to slow down, like a gentle hum beneath the surface of things. When Elio brought her order, he sat across from her for a moment. "You settling in all right?" She nodded. "That's the point, I think," he said. "Everyone needs somewhere that lets them pause." She took a bite of the galette and closed her eyes briefly. Elio smiled. Marisol spent a slow hour in the cafe. Later, as she climbed the stairs back to her apartment, she wondered about the story behind it. Back upstairs, the afternoon sun poured in. That evening, she prepared a simple dinner and played a record from the shelf labeled Slow Evenings. A jazz trio played softly through the speakers. She began reading, the words quiet and rich. It was a story about a girl who collected postcards she never sent. By the time she closed the book, the sky outside had turned lavender. Tonight, the apartment felt fuller somehow. Not louder, not crowded, just more alive. She poured a cup of tea. Marisol leaned on the railing and watched the world slow down. The next morning brought a hush that felt deliberate, as though the world had chosen silence on purpose. Marisol opened her eyes to the soft gray of a cloudy day, the kind that wrapped everything in a gentle hush. The usual golden sun had been replaced by a calm, diffused light. It softened the buildings across the street and turned every color muted, like the world had been painted in watercolor. People moved slower, holding umbrellas and walking carefully to avoid puddles. The cafe below was open, but the windows had fog slightly, blurring the figures inside. She opened it to find a small package on the floor. No one was in the hallway. She picked it up, surprised by its weight. Wrapped in brown paper and tied with twine, the parcel had no name or return address, just a tag that read, "From the shelves below," maybe both. She turned to page 23 and read a short passage that made her eyes sting a little. Rain had fallen quietly during the night, and droplets still clung to the iron balcony rail, catching light like tiny jewels. She made coffee and brought her sketchbook to the window. Today felt like it asked for stillness. Inside, candles flickered on every table, and quiet jazz hummed through the space. A few people were reading or writing, each one wrapped in their own little world. She had brought the little blue book with her and placed it nearby like a small companion. Outside, the clouds were starting to break. Eyes distant as if something heavy pressed on her thoughts. Without thinking much, Marisol tore a page from her sketchbook, the one with the candle and the closed letter, and folded it gently. Patches of pale blue appeared between them, thin as silk. She passed the woman's table and placed the folded page beside her teacup. She did not plan what to draw, only followed the feel of the day. A woman standing at a rainy window. Someone was playing live in the cafe. It had become a rhythm she could trust. She opened her window, letting the sound drift in with the night air. It wrapped around her like a lullaby. As she stood in the quiet kitchen, stirring her pot of soup, she smiled. A cat curled up in a circle on a stack of books. A candle flickering near a closed letter. Without meaning to, her lines captured the mood of her apartment that morning. She decided not to go down right away. Instead, she pulled a thick wool sweater over her shoulders, tied her hair up, and placed a record on the turntable. The vinyl hissed for a second, then filled the room with the slow sound of piano, a melody that rose and fell like breath. The clouds had broken open enough to let the late sun filter through. Beams of light moved slowly across her wooden floor, gold touching everything like a gentle promise. She picked up the little blue book and opened to the first page, beginning again from the start. She sat on the couch and turned it over in her hands. The cover was deep blue with silver stars scattered across it. The title was handwritten in delicate script, "For Days When You Are Quiet." She opened the first page and found another note inside. She sat on the floor, legs crossed, sketchbook balanced on her knees, and began to draw. Her hands moved almost on their own now. At some point, there was a soft knock on the door. Inside, nestled in tissue, was a book. To the one upstairs. "Thought you might like this on a day like today. Page 23 is my favorite." She smiled, warmth blooming in her chest. It had to be from Elio or Lyre. There is no rush to bloom. Some days, simply staying soft is enough. She closed the book and held it against her chest for a moment. Later, when the rain lightened to a mist, she walked down to the cafe. The air smelled of wet stone and cinnamon. Elio looked up from behind the counter. "Saw you got the book." She nodded. "It was perfect. Thank you." He just smiled and handed her a warm mug of tea. "No charge today. You're part of the cafe now." She sat at her usual table, the one near the foggy window, and opened her sketchbook again. As the afternoon passed, Marisol noticed a woman sitting alone 2 tables over. She looked tired, her coat still damp. When she got up to leave, "Just something you might like," she said quietly. The woman looked up, startled, then softened. "Thank you," she whispered. Back in her apartment, Marisol watched the light shift again. That evening, as she prepared dinner, she heard the soft notes of violin floating up through the floorboards. The apartment above the Cloud Café had become more than a place to stay. The next day brought a golden morning, clear and bright after the rain. The rooftops sparkled with leftover moisture, and the streets below glowed in the early light. Marisol stood on her balcony, a fresh cup of coffee warming her hands, and watched as the cafe below stirred to life. Before leaving her apartment, she packed a tote bag with her sketchbook, the little blue book Elio had given her, and a packet of thank you notes she had found in the desk drawer. She did not have an exact plan, only a sense that she wanted to say thank you, to leave something of herself in return. The air felt cleaner, fresher, warm chatter filled the air, and the smell of fresh espresso drifted out every time someone opened the door. Lyre waved from behind the counter, where he was arranging flowers into small vases, and she opened her sketchbook again, letting her pencil follow whatever shapes her hands wanted to draw. As she worked, she noticed a child at the next table watching her curiously. He had a knack for choosing unusual combinations: eucalyptus, soft purple asters, tiny yellow wildflowers. They looked like something from a storybook. She leaned forward on her elbows, her cocoa forgotten, like the entire city had taken a long, deep breath overnight. "Would you like to draw something?" There was something about the way the sunlight touched the buildings across the street that made everything seem sharper. She loves to draw, but didn't bring anything with her. In a few moments, the child was deeply focused, tongue poking from the corner of her mouth, lines appearing in quick strokes. Her mother, seated beside her, looked over with a grateful smile. The signs, the bricks, the laundry strung on lines outside windows, all looked newly defined. Even the distant sound of traffic felt musical. It was a picture of the café, bright and full of people, with little hearts drawn above each table. In a quiet corner near the back, she found a reading nook with 2 armchairs and a small lamp. From her apartment window above, she could see it glowing with evening life again. Soft music filtered through the floors. The city below continued its quiet rhythms, and Marisol drifted into sleep, the sound of soft jazz and clinking cups playing in her dreams. She paused at her door before entering, looking back down the stairs. A deep sense of peace settled in her chest. She sat there for a long time, flipping through pages, sketching the shape of the lamp's shadows, and jotting lines of poetry she found meaningful. She had even drawn Marisol with a sketchbook in her lap, and the cat from the apartment above peeking through a window. She stopped by a bookstore she had noticed before but never entered. Inside, it smelled of old pages and polished wood. A gray cat lay stretched out on a shelf marked poetry. She leaned against the railing and took in the scent of baked bread rising from the bakery 2 doors down. She dressed slowly that morning, choosing a soft cotton dress and her favorite cardigan. Her body felt rested, her mind quiet. "I brought you something," she said, pulling one of the thank you notes from her bag. Inside it, she had sketched a quiet moment from her apartment, a cup of tea beside a window with raindrops clinging to the glass. She passed it across the counter to Lyre. The cafe was busy by the time she came down. Marisol approached the counter and smiled. He opened it carefully, his fingers light. "This is beautiful. Just a small thank you," she said. "You don't need to thank us," he replied, eyes warm. "But we're glad you're here." She ordered a simple breakfast, eggs and toast, and found her usual table near the window. The morning light filled the space. The girl, no older than 7, had a head of curly black hair and wore a red raincoat, even though the sun was out. Marisol looked up and smiled. The girl's eyes lit up. "If it's all right," the woman said. Marisol tore out a blank page and offered the girl her pencil. "She's very good," Marisol said to the mother. "She says she wants to draw the whole world," the mother replied. When the girl was finished, she handed the drawing to Marisol. "I love this," Marisol said. "May I keep it?" The girl nodded seriously, then returned to her cocoa. Later that afternoon, Marisol wandered through the neighborhood, sketchbook and book in hand. The streets were full, but not crowded. She wandered through the aisles, running her fingers along the spines of books. As the light began to fade outside, she made her way back to the cafe. Upstairs, she lit a candle and opened a little blue book again. She read until her eyelids grew heavy. Marisol woke to the quiet hush of a foggy morning. The light slipping through her window was soft and pale, diffused by the low clouds that hung over the city. It made her room feel like a watercolor painting, edges blurred, colors gentle and unsure. She sat up slowly, wrapping her arms around her knees and watching the fog roll between the buildings like a tide. She reached for her journal and, without thinking much, began to write. Just small images and pieces of thoughts. The child's red coat, her handwriting moved freely, not in complete sentences at first. The sound of the bookstore cat purring, the smell of cardamom in her morning toast. Eventually, the pieces strung together into something more whole, something she might return to later when her mind needed a place to rest. After a quick breakfast of yogurt and honey, she made her way down the stairs. The cafe was quieter than usual. It felt like the city had turned into a dream. The fog had kept many people inside, it seemed, and the street was hushed except for the sound of soft footsteps and the occasional bicycle bell. Then, welcome to the Dream Cafe. A man with a violin passed by, his music muted and sweet. This building was designed as a mixed-use space, residential above, community center below. The cafe used to be a place where traveling musicians would stop and play for food or rest. He paused outside the cafe and played a single note that echoed like a call into the mist. Then he moved on, disappearing into the white, reading notes in faded ink and pencil. Some corners had little doodles in them, birds, stars, vines curling through the margin. He wrote letters to his sister describing the sunrise from that very window. Lyra was behind the counter, gently arranging a tray of pastries still warm from the oven. He looked up as she entered. It had no title on the spine, just a faded green cover. Inside were handwritten poems, some dated nearly a century ago. The pages were delicate, filled with the kind of love for the world that makes a person write things down just to remember they happened. "You're early," he said with a smile. "Stories upon stories, waiting to be found. I couldn't sleep too long," Marisol replied. But because, in that moment, the world seemed to breathe with her. One letter stood out. It described a dream the architect had about a staircase that led nowhere, but was filled with voices. She lit a few candles and made a small pot of soup. As it simmered, she wandered from room to room, looking at the apartment differently. The arches above the doors, the grooves in the floorboards, the windows that framed the sky so perfectly, it all felt touched by careful hands, designed for beauty and rest. Marisol copied the words into her journal. Through her open window, the soft clinking from the cafe below rose like wind chimes. Somewhere nearby, someone hummed a lullaby. The fog had begun to lift, and his cheeks were rosy from the cold, just enough to see the tops of streetlights glowing like distant stars, the lines making her chest tighten with something she could not name. His scarf trailed behind him like a banner, watching the fog swirl and gather. He took the seat across from her without asking and placed the papers on the table, letting the page tell the story in its own quiet way. Lyra laughed softly and offered her a lemon scone. She accepted it and took her usual seat by the window, the bow of his violin, the curve of the fog, holding a bundle of folded papers under one arm. It felt important to capture not just how it looked, but how it felt. She added strokes of gray around him like waves. Marisol sketched the moment quickly, the outline of the man's coat. Later in the morning, Elio appeared. "These," he said, "are from the university archives." Marisol looked at him, surprised. "What kind of papers?" "Old blueprints and planning notes." She ran her fingers over the yellowed pages. "One of the architects lived in your apartment," Elio added. Marisol smiled. "That explains the way the space feels." "It's like layers," Elio said, sipping his tea. They spent the rest of the morning sifting through the papers. That evening, Marisol stayed home. She stood in front of her bookshelf and pulled out a book she had never noticed before. She read one aloud. "When fog wraps the city like linen around a lamp, let yourself be still. The light will find you anyway." Marisol pressed the book to her chest and closed her eyes. The night moved gently around her. She felt at peace, not because everything was perfect or planned, The rain began softly just after midnight. It tapped on the windows of Marisol's apartment like a quiet invitation, steady and patient. She sat in bed with her knees tucked close, the book of handwritten poems still open beside her. Sleep had not come easily, but the sound of the rain held her like a lullaby. She rose slowly, pulling a blanket around her shoulders, and padded barefoot into the kitchen. She imagined him standing in the same spot, perhaps watching a similar night unfold. The thought made her feel both small and comforted, like she was part of a long, quiet story that had no need to rush. The kettle hissed gently on the stove as she watched the water boil. There was something comforting in the repetition of small tasks, like anchoring herself to the present. When the tea was ready, she carried the mug to the window and opened it just a little. The cool air slipped in. The map was old, likely from the early 1900s, with delicate ink lines tracing the streets and alleyways. Just a few shops and a parking lot. There, just a block from the café, was a garden marked with the words Mirror Grove, bringing with it the scent of wet pavement and blooming gardenia from a nearby balcony. Maybe it's still there, buried beneath everything else. The city felt different, as if the rain had softened its edges. They walked together down quiet streets until they reached the block on the old map. The street below was nearly empty, but when Elio checked his compass and coordinates, he pointed to a small corner near the back where ivy grew wild along the broken fence. But there was, and the more I read, the more I think it was something special. Her breath caught. Behind the greenery was a worn stone arch, nearly hidden by time. She pushed gently, and the gate creaked open. People wrote about it like it was a place of reflection and healing. She placed the mirror shard beside it and watched the flickering light dance across the surface. She opened her journal and began to write. Marisol wrote late into the night, cradled by the gentle hum of a world that was slowly revealing itself. Not about what she had found, but how it had made her feel a sense of stillness, wonder, and belonging. Literally, there was a small pool in the center, surrounded by mirrors and flowering trees. And a few tired magnolia trees still stood, their leaves glossy with rain. In the center was a shallow pool, dry and cracked, but ringed with shattered pieces of mirror half buried in the earth. They said the water held the sky so clearly it felt like stepping into another world. Marisol knelt beside the pool and picked up a shard. It reflected her face back at her, softened and luminous. A single taxi crept along, its headlights casting golden ripples across the puddles. From the far end of the avenue came the soft bark of a dog, quickly answered by another. Everything else was still. Marisol thought of the letter she had read earlier, the one written by the architect who once lived here. By morning, the rain had stopped. The sky remained heavy and gray, but the city had taken on a kind of freshness, like everything had been gently washed and set back in place. Marisol dressed simply and made her way downstairs. She opened her notebook and began sketching the cafe's new. Centerpiece, a large glass jar filled with floating lemon slices and sprigs of mint, glowing like stained glass in the morning light. At the Cloud Café, Lyre greeted her with a wave, already busy arranging fresh croissants on a tray. "You're just in time," he said. "Apricot jam today." "I found it last night while going through the university's forgotten boxes. It's a hand-drawn map of this neighborhood, but with something unusual." Marisol smiled and chose her favorite table. The door chimed as Elio entered, his coat dusted with raindrops. "You both need to see something," he said without preamble, placing a folder between them. Marisol leaned in. "I walk that street all the time," she said. "There's no garden now." Elio tapped the paper. Lyre looked over the map, intrigued. Marisol felt a quiet excitement bloom in her chest. "Let's go see it." They finished their breakfast quickly, bundled into their coats, and stepped into the damp morning. The parking lot was there, as expected, ringed by shuttered shops and cracked pavement. "This is it," he said. Marisol approached the fence and peered through the vines. The three of them stepped inside. It was a forgotten space, overgrown and quiet, but not empty. Ferns had made their home among the stone benches. They stood in silence, letting the discovery settle around them. "It's still here," she whispered. "Just sleeping." That evening, Marisol returned to her apartment and lit a single candle. Outside, the city exhaled, and above the cloud cafe, in the apartment where stories and dreams rested between the floorboards. In the days that followed their discovery of the hidden grove, Marisol found herself pulled more deeply into the rhythm of the city. During her walks, she would trace her fingers across the pages of Elio's old map, trying to picture what the garden must have looked like 100 years ago. She sketched its contours in her notebook, adding flowering trees and birds and children reading under the shade of magnolias. Though most of it was her imagination, it didn't feel like invention. It felt like remembering. She still woke early and still drank her tea by the window, but there was a new stillness to her mornings. Lyre brought small things to leave behind: a jar of clover honey, a stone with a painted sun, a folded note written in a language he never shared. Elio came with books, sitting on the old stone benches and reading aloud to the empty space, his voice drifting through the trees like mist. Elio said, "Maybe we should clean up the grove." A sense that the apartment itself was listening. It felt like the quiet of a forest right before sunrise, filled with invisible life, not rebuild it. Marisol cleared ivy from the stone arch, revealing more of its curved design. Elio uncovered a line of carved symbols just beneath the benches. Lyre gathered the mirror shards and began assembling them like a puzzle on a large cloth, never forcing any pieces, just waiting to see which fit together. He had set the mirror shards into a rough circle, the reflections dancing like water, not change it. Each time they returned, it welcomed them with something new: a blooming vine, a soft beam of sunlight through the branches, the low call of a bird they had never heard before. They whispered through shadows, echoed through leaves, and wrapped themselves in quiet moments shared without hurry. "Just help it breathe." She lit a candle and placed one of the mirror shards on her windowsill, where it caught the last gold of sunset. The grove had started to shift, and like her, it had found its way back to stillness, and we let it tell us what it needs. "Look at this," he said, holding up a rounded shard. Rain sprinkled against the glass again. The early light was golden, pouring through the clouds in broad ribbons. She opened the window and leaned out, breathing in the scent of baked bread and dew. The bells of a bicycle jingled below, followed by laughter from the café, bringing fresh pastries and a folded letter he found in a library archive. It mentioned the grove by name and spoke of its purpose: a quiet place for reflection and repair, not just for the body, but the soul, as gentle as it had been the week before. The scent of cinnamon filled the air. At first, it was just a place to rest, a place in between, but it had wrapped itself around her with gentle insistence, he said, standing beside her. Not because we're finished, but because it's ready. And now she felt more rooted than she had in years. The faint chime of a wind catcher someone had hung nearby, and the sound of her own breath matching the rhythm of the garden. Outside, a couple shared an umbrella, laughing as they darted across the street. The pool, once dry and cracked, now caught small puddles of rainwater. Vines hung lower from the broken arch. For just a moment, Marisol thought she saw more than her own face. There was sky, but the wrong kind, with silver clouds spiraling in slow motion, and tiny mushrooms dotted the base of the trees. It was as if their presence had nudged the garden awake. The mirror grove stayed with her. Elio and Lyre had taken to visiting the grove each afternoon. One afternoon, Marisol joined them again. Lyre was kneeling by the mirror pieces, carefully brushing away dirt. The reflection shimmered oddly, not like normal glass. She blinked and it was gone, I think it's remembering too, she said. That evening, back in the cafe, the three of them sat near the front window. I've been thinking. Lyra nodded slowly. Marisol sipped her chamomile tea. Over the next few weeks, they brought soft rags, brushes, and gardening gloves. They worked quietly, sometimes speaking, but often not. The grove never rushed them. One morning, as Marisol placed a sketchbook and thermos into her satchel, she paused beside the window of her apartment. She had never meant to stay here so long. At the grove, Lyra was already there. We might need to stop soon, Marisol nodded. I think you're right. Elio arrived not long after. Marisol stood in the center of the grove and closed her eyes. She could hear the wind brushing against the branches. She did not need to explain what she felt. The others understood. Some places did not speak in words. Later, as the light faded and the city stirred with evening, Marisol returned to the apartment. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, or what the grove would become in time, but for now, she knew it was alive. The first signs of spring arrived quietly. It began with a single bud pressing through the soil beside the cracked fountain in the grove. Marisol spotted it as she passed by one afternoon, a small curl of green lifting toward the light, almost too delicate to touch. When the silence felt different, like a breath taken in. Some days they stayed for hours, reading, writing, or simply resting under the trees. Not fear or sorrow, but a kind of gentle urgency. She dressed quickly and made her way down the stairs, the scent of roasted beans rising from the cafe below. Elio gave her a warm glance from behind the counter. His sleeves rolled up and a smear of cinnamon dusting his cheek. Other days, they only passed by the arch, nodding in quiet thanks. She crouched beside it, smiling as though it were an old friend returned from a long journey. Her reflection looked back at her from a dozen angles, but then something else appeared. It remembers, he said, more than we do. She began to write not a poem or a journal entry, but a letter, of friends who listened without needing answers, of windows that opened onto golden mornings, of gardens that could sleep and wake, and of the way a place, even when hidden in a city's forgotten corner, could offer something close to peace. She wrote as if to someone she had not met yet, someone who might one day find the grove and wonder what it had meant. A second figure stood beside her in the glass, though no one was there in the clearing. Instead, they sat on the low stone benches, letting the stillness fill them. The sounds of the city faded behind the hush of trees and the quiet turning of the wind. Somewhere far below, the garden waited, not for a grand unveiling or a crowd, but for the next moment of stillness, the next quiet step. I think this is the kind of goodbye that doesn't mean leaving, the kind she used to collect as a child, and a strand of blue thread from her coat. Elio passed around pastries wrapped in cloth, the scent of cardamom warming the air, painting the sky in streaks of peach and violet. The three of them stood together near the arch, watching the light shift over the grove. The grove felt alive in a new way, like a story ready to be told aloud. The image shimmered and shifted like sunlight on water, then faded. By now, the grove had changed in ways none of them had predicted. Not dramatically, not all at once, but through slow, steady gestures. Moss had softened the edges of the stones. The scent of bread, rain, and growing things rose to meet her. She placed another mirror shard on the shelf beside her bed, not to look into, but to remember. Ferns had grown in clusters around the roots of the trees, and maybe we return when it needs us again. The kind that leaves the world smelling like new leaves and clean stone. Lyre was already waiting at the entrance to the grove, hands in his coat pockets, eyes watching the sky. The mirror shards reflected not only the sky, but hints of other days' moments that may have never happened or ones waiting to arrive. The three of them visited the grove often, but never every day. They had learned to come when it called. Marisol noticed how the wind seemed to pause at the edge of the grove. It looked like a spiral, but with no center, only gentle arcs widening toward the edges. The light danced across it, catching colors they hadn't seen before: pale gold, soft blue, and something like the hue of morning mist. How the branches of the trees shifted not with motion, but with memory. One morning, Marisol woke with a pull in her chest. "You feel it too?" he asked. She nodded. Outside, the street was still wet from a light rain. "It's ready," he said softly. They walked in together, a quiet folding around them. In the center of the clearing, where the mirror shards had been slowly arranged by Lyre, a new pattern had formed overnight. Marisol stepped closer, careful not to disturb anything. Lyre saw it too. They did not speak for a while. As afternoon light filtered through the leaves, Marisol pulled a worn notebook from her satchel. She wrote of silence and stories. When she finished, she folded the letter carefully and placed it between two stones near the fountain. She added a small pine cone beside it. The sun dipped low. Marisol spoke softly. Elio nodded. "It just means we carry it with us." Lyre smiled. That night, back in her apartment above the café, Marisol lit a candle and opened the window. As she drifted into sleep, and the story, like the garden, continued to grow. The days began to stretch. Morning light poured more easily through Marisol's tall windows, warming the corners of the apartment where shadows used to linger. The plants on her windowsill reached higher each day, curling toward the brightness with quiet determination. Spring had settled in completely now, with crisp air in the mornings and laughter returning to the streets below. She had fallen into a rhythm, one guided less by clocks and more by texture and tone. "You're the one who tends the mirror garden, aren't you?" Her voice was soft but certain. "We take care of it, yes, as best we can." The sounds of the cafe below, Elio's soft whistling, the bell above the door, the hum of conversation became her music. Marisol unwrapped it slowly. Inside was a thin mirror fragment, weathered but intact. Unlike the ones in the grove, this one had a line of gold painted across the back, like a horizon. When I was your age, maybe younger, there was no name for it then. Just a place where things made sense when nothing else did. She painted in the late afternoons, not for anyone but herself. "Now, I'd like to leave it here. You've made something of this place. You've turned remembering into something gentler." They were a way of being, a kind of stillness that invited the heart to rest and, in its own time, to open. Simple landscapes, dreamlike skies, once even a sketch of the mirror spiral in the grove. It did not match the magic of the real thing, but the memory had flowed through her hands with unexpected ease. Lyre had started to bring books again. Not borrowed ones, but his own. Journals filled with drawings, clippings, and quiet questions written in pencil. No label. She began to notice small signs of the world shifting, not in grand ways, but in the patience of the city's breath. The clouds drifted lower some days, as if brushing the rooftops in greeting. Lights from other windows flickered more often, and she wondered who else might be watching the same sky, holding the same quiet thoughts. No explanation. She passed under the arch and felt the hush settle over her, familiar and new. The spiral remained in place, but a new stone had been added at the edge. On it rested a folded piece of paper. Just another piece of a story unfolding in its own time. He never explained where the books came from or what they were meant to become. She was older than Marisol, maybe in her late 50s, as the wind moved through the branches, carrying scents of jasmine and earth. Marisol felt something settle inside her. Not an answer, but a comfort. With silver-streaked hair tied in a low braid and a bag made of patchwork fabric slung over her shoulder. She ordered a lavender tea and sat by the window without speaking. He simply placed them on the café counter and said, "For the shelves," as if their destination was obvious. The cafe itself had changed too. Not in design or menu, but in mood. Visitors lingered longer. Some returned just to sit in silence by the windows. A woman who once brought her laptop every day stopped using it entirely and began to fill sketchbooks instead. She watched the room with the attention of someone who had once belonged to it. When Elio greeted her, he seemed to recognize something, though not a name. They exchanged a quiet nod before he returned to the kitchen. A child left folded paper cranes in the line along the stairwell, one more each day, as if marking a secret path upward. It was on one of these slow afternoons that a stranger arrived. Marisol noticed her not because she stood out, but because of the way she observed. After an hour, the woman rose and approached Marisol's table. Marisol hesitated, then nodded. The woman smiled, as if she'd been hoping for that answer. I visited it many years ago. She placed something wrapped in cloth on the table. I took this with me when I left, the woman said. I didn't know why. I think I do now. Marisol looked up. Would you like to return it? The woman shook her head. Later that day, Marisol placed the shard on the cafe's main shelf, beside Lyre's journals. The apartment above remained her sanctuary. That evening, she walked to the grove alone. She opened it and read, "Not everything lost is waiting to be found. Some things are waiting to be remembered. Thank you for remembering." She placed the note gently back where she found it, then sat beneath her favorite tree. The grove, the cafe, and the apartment above, it had all become more than places. Marisol awoke to a morning of unusual stillness. The usual chatter from the cafe downstairs had not yet begun, and the streets below were quieter than she expected. For a moment, she thought it might be earlier than usual, but the sun was already climbing. Pale gold light slanted through the curtains, soft as a whispered invitation. She moved slowly through her morning routine, listening for signs of life. The kettle hummed, the scent of coffee rose, unsure if it was meant for her or simply left behind in the open. But she followed. Up the back stairs, past the floorboards that creaked in a familiar rhythm, and out the door that led to the roof. But there was no clinking of cups from below, no flour-dusted Elio humming from the kitchen. Curiosity pulled her down the stairs, barefoot and mug in hand. The cafe was open, but empty. No patrons, no Elio, no Lyre. The doors were unlocked, and the chairs were all neatly in place. One of the regulars from the cafe, a girl who often read books by the window, stepped forward first. An elderly woman placed a strand of pearls into a jar of soil. She looked down at her empty hands and wondered what she might offer. Her breath, perhaps, as the note had suggested. Another person offered a page torn from a journal, words smudged but still visible. Others smiling in that soft, distant way of those remembering something precious. There was no explanation for any of it, no need for one. She placed a paper boat made from an old train ticket into a small basin of water. It floated for a few seconds before tipping gently over. We've been tending something, all of us. We thought today was the right day. Not really, it just gathered itself, like so many things do here. They grieved without surrender. A garden of memory tended not with tools, but with attention. They made space for things to grow in the silence. On the counter sat a note written in Lyre's careful print. She pictured the shape of her solitude, the quiet weight it had carried, and offered it to the sky. Come to the roof garden. Bring nothing but your breath. No one spoke. Some walked down the stairs. She returned to her apartment and stood at the balcony. She looked down at the cafe and up at the sky, where clouds moved like slow dancers across a blue stage. The moment felt held not by hands, but by time itself. Others remained among the plants, tending leaves, adjusting trellises. Marisol stayed behind with Elio and Lyre, watching the morning unfold. Marisol brewed tea for strangers who felt like old friends. The note on the counter remained, though no one else seemed to read it. The kind of hush that settled over them felt like the kind shared during a prayer, or the moment before music begins. The grove taught us that presence is the gift. She stared at the words for a moment, each one holding a different object, a candle. A stone, a photograph, a folded scarf. Elio stood near the garden bed, soil still clinging to his hands. Lyre stood beside him, eyes closed, arms loose at his sides. We're letting go of things. Not to forget them, but to make space. What she found was not what she expected. A dozen or more people stood quietly on the rooftop. Some were faces she recognized from the cafe, others were strangers. They were not speaking, but they were not silent in the lonely way. Elio looked up when Marisol stepped out and nodded once. Lyre opened his eyes. She moved forward and took her place at the edge of the group. One by one, each person followed. A man released a handful of dried leaves. Marisol had brought nothing. She closed her eyes. In her mind, she imagined placing her loneliness into the circle, not to discard it, but to acknowledge it. When she opened her eyes, a breeze passed through the garden, gentle and warm. The others remained still, some weeping quietly. After a time, they dispersed. You didn't need an object, Lyre said. Marisol nodded. Did you plan this? Elio chuckled. Later that day, the cafe was filled again. Not with noise, but with warmth. The air seemed lighter. When the sun began to set, casting its soft fire across the windows, she had come to this place for stillness and had found instead a kind of quiet movement. The city breathed differently here. People remembered without breaking, and in that growth, she realized they had all become part of something larger. The morning light filtered through the high windows of the apartment, casting soft gold over everything it touched. The hum of chatter, the hiss of the espresso machine, and the occasional clink of plates had become a part of her daily symphony. Each sound grounded her more deeply in this place she now called home. She didn't need an alarm clock anymore. The cafe's rhythm had sensed with hers, and together they moved through the days like an old song she never tired of hearing. I dreamed of warm bread and old music. Amelia stood in the kitchen barefoot, feeling the cool tiles beneath her toes as she poured warm water over her tea leaves. The gentle swirl of steam rose toward her face, and she closed her eyes for a moment to inhale the scent of jasmine and honey. The breakfast crowd replaced by quiet laptop workers and soft jazz playing overhead. Amelia walked down the narrow stairs and slipped into the cafe, waving to Theo behind the counter. He was balancing a tray of golden croissants and didn't see her at first. Lily asked, eyes wide and curious. But she knew he would smell her lavender soap and turn around within seconds. It was a slow morning, the kind she had come to treasure. Ever since discovering the hidden music room tucked behind the bakery's back pantry, her dreams had taken on new shapes. The room was dim, but morning light slipped through the high stained glass window, throwing dancing colors onto the wooden floor. She sat by the piano, pressing one soft key. The small, dusty piano, the shelves of forgotten sheet music, and the way the air always seemed to shimmer in there. Lily popped out of the kitchen carrying a bowl of lemon glaze. Was as if the room itself remembered melodies long after the instruments had gone silent. Instead, she let herself become part of the moment, the music, the quiet pulse of something larger than herself. Below her, the cafe was already bustling. She would tiptoe through the back hallway, careful not to disturb the kitchen staff cleaning up for the night, and sit with the upright piano. She never played more than a few soft notes, just enough to stir the air. Sometimes she would hum quietly. It wasn't from any sheet or memory. The scent of the cafe's bread had crept through the floorboards. Mizzo meowed once, then went back to sleep. Just something that floated from her fingers as if it had waited all morning to be released. As she played, a curious thing happened. The room felt warmer. The colors from the window shifted slightly, casting blues where there had been reds, gold where there had been green. Unsure if the music was hers or something she was remembering from the space itself. Today she had no appointments. Her journal lay open on the table by the window, a fresh page waiting for thoughts, sketches or lists that might never get crossed out. She took her tea to the table, her cat Mizzo already curled there, tail flicking lazily. The breeze pushed against the sheer curtain, lifting it just enough to make the room feel like it was breathing. She picked up her pen and began to write. Clouds moved in quietly last night. She paused, smiling at the image in her mind. Amelia had started visiting the music room in the evenings. Today, she felt pulled there again. By late morning, the cafe had calmed slightly. "Good morning," he called, not missing a beat. "Morning," she replied, drifting past the register. As she made her way behind the counter and toward the back, "Are you going to the room?" Amelia nodded. "Just to listen." Lily smiled and stepped aside. Amelia eased the door open and stepped inside. The note rang out, tender and low, then another. She played a slow, simple melody. It was as if the room was answering her. She didn't question it. When the final note settled into silence, Amelia sat still, hands resting on the keys. She whispered into the hush, "Thank you." She left the room quietly, heart full. Back upstairs, the apartment glowed with mid-morning light. Amelia returned to her journal and wrote just one line. "The world is full of songs we don't know we're part of." Amelia stood by the window that evening, watching the soft drizzle fall across the street below. The glow from the cafe windows gave the puddles a golden shimmer, and inside, Theo was closing shop for the night. The tune had lingered in her mind all day, each note echoing gently behind her thoughts like a familiar voice. The paper was thick and aged at the edges, like it had waited a very long time to be found. Her fingers tingled as she unfolded it carefully. As she opened the cabinet to reach for her favorite teapot, a blue one painted with tiny clouds, something unexpected caught her eye. He waved as he flipped the chairs onto tables, and she waved back with a smile. It was her favorite kind of weather, the sort that wrapped everything in quiet and gave people permission to slow down. Few ever hear it, and fewer still choose to stay. But if you do, you'll carry its rhythm long after you leave. The music is older than memory. Let it guide you. Maybe this place was not just made of bricks and beams, but of echoes and intentions. The trees shimmered faintly, their leaves heavy and dark green. From a nearby window, someone was playing a violin. The sound drifted up to her gently, a slow and aching tune that wove itself into the night air. Maybe every corner remembered something, and maybe it had waited for someone to listen. And somehow, this message had waited inside the teapot she used almost every day, only to be discovered now. Then poured hot water into the pot as she always did. The jasmine leaves swirled inside, fragrant and warm. She let it steep while she wrapped herself in a soft shawl and stepped out onto the tiny balcony that overlooked the street. The soft light from the hallway lamp, the tiny crack in the corner tile, the bookshelf filled with mismatched novels and plant cuttings. It all felt alive. Not just comforting or beautiful, but truly alive. She turned away from the window and made her way to the kitchen, humming the melody she had played in the music room that morning. There, nestled inside the pot where the infuser should have been, was a folded piece of parchment. Amelia hesitated for just a moment before reaching in and pulling it out. "Tonight I feel like a note in a long, quiet melody, and I think I finally found the place where I belong." The note was handwritten in ink, the script neat and slanted. From the floor below, a soft thud sounded as Theo closed the bakery door for the night. The smell of cinnamon and flour still lingered in the air. The music continued to hum a lullaby for anyone who cared enough to hear it. Mizzo curled up beside her pillow and purred once before falling asleep. To the one who listens, she sat at the kitchen table, holding the note in her lap, unsure whether to smile or cry. "You found the song that sleeps within these walls." Amelia read it twice, then a third time, her heart thudding gently, not with fear, but with a curious kind of wonder. Someone had written this long ago. Someone who had heard the same songs, felt the same quiet presence that now stirred through her days. She looked around the apartment as if seeing it again for the first time, and maybe that was the secret. She placed the letter gently beside her journal. Below, the rain had stopped, leaving the cobblestones damp and shining. Amelia closed her eyes and listened. The letter's words echoed in her heart. You found the song that sleeps within these walls. That night, before bed, she tucked the parchment into the back of her journal and added a final entry for the day. There are places that wait for us not to change them, but to become part of their story. She turned off the light and let the darkness settle around her. The apartment breathed with her, gently and slowly. And somewhere beneath the floorboards, or perhaps in the walls themselves, morning arrived with a gold-tinted breeze. Amelia awoke to the smell of fresh bread drifting up from Theo's bakery. Mizzo had already slipped away. Her gaze fell on the journal she had left on the table the night before. Still holding the letter tucked safely inside, she picked it up, running her hand over the cover. Probably downstairs to charm a croissant out of someone. Its spine was plain and the edges were worn, but it hadn't been there yesterday. She approached slowly, unsure whether it had always been hidden behind the others or had truly appeared overnight. The little cat had made herself a favorite among the early morning customers, weaving between chairs with silent confidence and knowing eyes. Then, without fully understanding why, she opened the first page and began to write. Amelia stretched, feeling the quiet peace of the apartment wrap around her like a favorite sweater. As she padded into the living room, I don't know who left this book for me or if it was always here, but it feels like an invitation. Then something caught her eye on the bookshelf. It was a small leather-bound book she didn't remember placing there, and I figured you might need something warm to go with your cloudy tea. There was something different about this book, something expectant. Amelia shared the story of the teapot letter and the mysterious blank book. I mean, not literally magic, but it listens. It remembers. And when someone like you moves in, someone who listens back, it starts answering. Theo listened quietly, nodding at all the right moments. Curious, she opened it. She opened it to find Theo holding a small basket of scones wrapped in a linen cloth. Not just to be lived in, but to be remembered. The pages were blank. Amelia placed the new book on the windowsill where the sun could warm it. Streetlights blinked on one by one. The air cooled, carrying the scent of rain that hadn't yet fallen. And inside the apartment, the story continued, unfolding page by page, a lullaby in ink, written a soft rhythm of quiet joy. It felt right, letting it rest in the light for a while before she continued. Maybe it's for writing what comes next. Pausing at the small wooden closet with its uneven door, the one that creaked each time she passed. Inside was a narrow shelf where she had placed dried flowers from the first bouquet Theo had given her. She thought about writing a story in the blank book, a story about the people who had lived here before, or maybe the ones who would come after. Every single one. She flipped through them slowly, expecting to find a message or symbol tucked somewhere inside, but there was nothing. Opening to a page and discovering not just her handwriting, but her thoughts, her mornings, her quiet nights of tea and music. She opened the book to a fresh page and began to write again. This time, she wrote not about the past, but about the bakery's laughter drifting up from the street. The sound of birds nesting in the eaves, and the strange joy of realizing you're exactly where you're supposed to be. Not even a name or a date, just clean, creamy pages that seemed to hum with quiet potential. She sat at the table and stared at the book for a while. This morning, the sunlight touched the corner of the window just right, and it made the whole room feel like a painting. The moment she lifted the pen, the ink shimmered faintly on the page before settling. It hadn't done that in her regular journal. A knock at the door startled her. "I had extras," he said with a grin. "Perfect timing," she said. "Come in." As they sat on the floor with the basket between them, "I think the apartment's always been like that," he said. Amelia looked down at the blank book beside her. Then maybe it's not foretelling the past, she said. Theo smiled, or both. Later that afternoon, after Theo returned to the cafe, she walked the apartment slowly, trailing her fingers along the old walls. She imagined someone else finding the book years later, and maybe she realized that's what the apartment wanted. That evening, she lit the soft lanterns and brewed a pot of hibiscus tea. Outside, twilight deepened. The final morning came soft and slow, wrapped in silver blue clouds that drifted over the city like silk scarves. The shelves were bare. The watercolor paintings she had grown so attached to were carefully wrapped in tissue. The gentle hum of the refrigerator, the rustle of the curtains, and the distant laughter from the street below sounded louder somehow, as if they too were saying goodbye. Elise stood at the window, her hands curled around a warm mug of lavender tea. Below, the Cloud Café had just opened its doors, and the comforting sounds of clinking cups and gentle music filtered upward into her quiet home. Elise thought of the friends she had made, each one finding their way through the cafe doors and into her life, like sunlight slipping through window panes, the kind of silence that didn't need filling. Her fingers trailed the kitchen counter where she had made endless cups of tea, the windowsill where she once placed a tiny pot of daisies that had somehow bloomed in winter, and the bookshelf that had overflowed with stories and laughter. Inside, the tables were full. Conversations hummed like soft music. Someone was sketching in a notebook. She didn't know what came next, but she didn't need to. The city unfolded in front of her like a page yet to be filled. The scent of coffee and clouds lingered in the air behind her. Someone else was reading aloud. The barista waved through the window. Elise waved back. Each step felt like a gentle farewell. There was Henry, who once couldn't say a single sentence without apologizing. She left behind the lavender plant, now large and blooming, with a note that read, "For the next dreamer who finds themselves here, may this place be your beginning," and a letter. From all of us. Now, he led the poetry group every Thursday night. And May, who used to tremble at the thought of singing in public. They sat together on the floor, as they often had, sharing bites of buttery pastry and moments of silence. The letter was signed by dozens of hands, some familiar, some not. It spoke of kindness, of warmth, of the small things Elise had done without realizing they mattered. Had just signed her first contract with a small music label. There were countless other dreamers, loners, wanderers who had walked into the cafe and left a piece of their heart behind. It was her last day in the apartment. Elise opened the door to find Lucy, holding a paper bag and a small envelope. The last day above the cafe that had changed her life. All around her, boxes were stacked neatly. There had been offers before new apartments, new neighborhoods, even a new city, but Elise had always stayed. Something about the apartment had rooted her to this place. It wasn't just the view or the charm of the Cloud Café. It was the life she had rebuilt here after everything fell apart. Now, the call to move on didn't feel like escape. It felt like a quiet invitation. As she sipped her tea, the doorbell rang just as the clock struck 10. "I brought you one last breakfast croissant," Lucy said, trying not to cry. Elise took the bag and the envelope with trembling hands. "You turned this place into more than just an apartment," Lucy whispered. "It became a lighthouse." They sat in silence after that. Later that day, Elise took one last walk through the apartment. When the movers arrived, Elise handed over the keys with a small smile. The street was golden with afternoon light as she walked down one last time. She paused in front of the Cloud Café. She didn't step inside. She didn't need to. That chapter had been written with all the care and wonder she could give. Elise turned toward the horizon. She carried the warmth with her. She always would,